Hello, welcome to The Rage. This is not an episode of Apostate Alliance, and this is not an episode of Horse and Bear. This is an episode that came about because me and one of our guests tonight were having a discussion on Twitter, and we decided to bring the conversation to a live stream. I'm here tonight with our fearless leader, Nokasuchi. Socka account is here with us tonight, and our Christian guest is Scott Paeth. Am I saying that right, Scott?
Yeah, that's correct.
And tonight's topic is our divine omnipotence and human free will mutually exclusive, with a subtopic of and this came from our conversation on Twitter, of whether the fact that human beings can interpret scripture, does that negate the fact that God would be omnipotent? And I want to apologize if there's anybody in the audience right now who feels like they want to come in and join this conversation. Please DM me or some Nokasuchi, or shout out to us in the live chat, and we'll get you a link. We're going to have two Christians on tonight. One of them had to cancel. And I don't want you to think we're going to be, beating up on Scott here, being the only Christian here. We would like another Christian to come in, and there was a couple that said they might be able to make it in, who I sent links to. We'll see what happens. I want to introduce everybody and then just jump right into the conversation.
Real quick, John, just to let the audience know, I am only here as a moderator role, so I'll just be running the comments, putting comments up, and if people talk over each other, then I'll cut in and stop that. But I am not really part of this conversation. I'm just playing moderator.
And then, so and if you end up towards the end, if you have questions for anybody, at the Rage in the live chat, and Knock will pick up on that. I tried to get another Christian to come in. I reached out to so many Christians today. I feel like I converted back to Christianity. So we're going to get started here. Like I said, the main topic is divine omnipotence. Is that something that can be when human beings have free will? And we and Scott and then a couple other atheists and Christians talked about this at length on Twitter. And I want to throw it over to Scott first to lay his case out, and then we'll take it from there.
Thanks, John. And first of all, let me thank you for having me on the program. It's a pleasure to be able to sit down and talk about these issues together. I thought the conversation on Twitter was really kind of very interesting, and I find a lot of those conversations on Twitter kind of at a certain point do hit a bit of a point of diminishing returns, precisely because it's just very difficult to convey your ideas in 144 or 200, whatever it's up to now, 288 characters a pop. So this is a really useful way to expand on that conversation. Now, if I could kind of briefly lay out where I'm coming from on this, I think that the main point of dispute between us had to do with, as you pointed out, it was originally this question of, does the fact that people can read the Bible, or that God doesn't sort of make the Bible so completely unambiguous that it would be impossible to misinterpret, is that an argument against divine omnipotence? And then I think it sort of grew into the broader question of whether or not there's an incompatibility between omnipotence and human freedom. And I thought that it would be useful to, begin by thinking through some of those categories. What do we really mean by omnipotence when we use the term, and what do we mean by freedom? And I would begin by defining omnipotence as the capacity for God to do anything that it is possible to do. Right. In other words, God, if it's something that is not internally contradictory from a sort of a logical perspective, then it would be possible for God to do. But for example, something that's internally contradictory, like making a square circle, would not be something that would be possible for God to do. Now, actually, and I've been mulling this over, and the question of freedom from a human perspective actually was a much harder thing for me to nail down, and frankly always has been. And just, well, what do we really mean when we're talking about human freedom? Do we mean by that kind of a libertarian autonomy and the ability to kind of choose from among an array of options, or do we mean something different by that? And for my purposes right now, I think what I'd like to do is stick with the definition that basically means that human freedom is that capacity to make choice. Right, that capacity to say yes or no to a particular set of options. Because I think for the purposes of understanding its relationship to omnipotence, that's the most useful definition. Though there may be some other ideas of freedom that will plug into that as well. And so the case that I was making on Twitter and that I'd like to pursue with you this evening is just precisely this question of whether or not these two ideas, God's capacity to do anything that is possible to do, and then the human capacity to freely choose, for example, how to interpret the Bible, or whether or not to accept the revelation of God, or however or not you want to frame that, whether or not those things are or are not compatible with one another. So that is, at least from my understanding, the question that we're seeking to address.
Well, right, and I'm going to throw it to Socka, since you and I have already had a chance to discuss this, but just to fill in, what you were talking about, the original tweet that got us on this is Randall Rouser was responding to someone who was commenting on the fact that, well, hey, why didn't God, the Bible is supposedly his revelatory word. Why didn't God make the Bible such that anyone could understand it easily and there was no need for interpretation? And then that's where the discussion that, there's your dog.
Pizza Man's there, I think.
Yeah. So, and then our conversation grew out of that. We had both responded to that thread and went down the rabbit hole we went down. But Socka, I want to throw it to you and let you respond to what Scott has said so far.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, I think that one of the good things about this so far that Scott's done is that is just starting off with trying to define these terms. And I mean, that's always the biggest problem when you get in any type of discussion about omnipotence and free will, and I mean, about 90% of other philosophical topics, is what do we actually mean by these things? Now, I mean, obviously, though, that there's going to be some disagreement with these, and where one of the problems with something like omnipotence, for example, is that the more you kind of look into these definitions, the more you have to start walking back some of these characteristics. So, I mean, you started off by defining omnipotence essentially as the ability to do all logically possible things. That's not, that's great. Okay, awesome. Essentially, you can't do anything that wouldn't inherit a contradiction. But then obviously the first pushback that you're going to get on this is that, can God lie? Can God sin? These things don't seem to carry with them any type of inherent contradiction, to those just on its surface. You have to start going in and starting to define these, the certain characteristics within that again to try to revamp that. And we end up to the stage where you have to start defining omnipotence less about just being able to do all possible things, but doing all possible things that correspond to the nature of such a being. But that doesn't really tell you that much. I mean, most things can do what their nature allows them to do. In fact, the simpler a thing is, the less benchmarks it has to hit in order to do all those possible things that are allowed within its nature. And you hear these examples that get brought up, like a desk lamp. Its nature's really simple. Switch turns on, light goes on. As long as it fulfills that role, the possible things that are within its nature to do, that lamp is now omnipotent by that definition. So, I think that just the defined category of omnipotent is really kind of a difficult one to God, because there's certain things that we want to rule out that God can't do or won't do, and I think that kind of has problems within that definition.
So, and I want to point out too, because someone had that I'd reached out to come here today had pointed out, well, when I said, is divine omnipotence mutually exclusive from human free will? They said, well, don't you mean omniscience? And I said, well, in my mind, right or wrong, when I think of omnipotence, I think that inclusive of all the omnis. Now, in the definition that you gave for omnipotence, aside from the problem that Socka has identified, I don't see how the way you define omnipotence would actually change omniscience, because omniscience is knowledge of everything. It's knowledge of the past, present, and future. I'm going to butcher this. I don't remember what the exact scripture is, but it says somewhere in the Bible that God knows you and of you and what you will do long before He creates you, and so. Even given the if we take the definition you want to give for omnipotence, how does that mitigate omniscience? And if God is completely omniscient and knows what's going to happen in the future, then how can humans have free will?
Yeah, well, actually, there's a lot packed into what both of you have said. And Socka, you kind of anticipated one of my replies to where you started when you talked about the question of can God lie, and of course, one of the answers to that that's typically given is, well, the reason why God would not lie, or is that because God is truth, right? So you'd say, well, so if God is truth, then God it would be incapable of God. God would be incapable of doing that which is against God's nature. So insofar as that, insofar as you brought that up, I think you and I are on the same page. I'm not really quite sure where you went with the desk lamp analogy, because I think that the question of divine omnipotence is far more expansive than that, because of course we're not just talking about sort of a simple function like turning on or turning off. Rather, I think that the question of divine omnipotence relates to the whole range of creative activities that God can potentially engage in interaction with creation. There's something else.
I think real quick to clarify for you, what I believe Socka was saying was that if you're going to define God, His omnipotence, as doing everything that's within His nature that is logical, well, then the reason he mentioned the light bulb is that a light is meant to turn on and give light and then turn off and the light goes away. That's all its function is. So if it can do that, then it's omnipotent by your definition. It's doing everything within its nature that's logical.
Yeah, well, obviously, I would say in that respect, in that respect, the lamp is potent, right? And it has a power which it fulfills. It would not be omnipotent because it would not be able to do again, that whole range of creative things that fall into the category of things that we anticipate God doing. The fact that there is a potentially large range of things that are both logically impossible and incompatible with God's nature does not mean that there's not also, nevertheless, an infinite number of things of which God is capable that are compatible with God's nature. There's another direction I want to go in. I'll hold on to that, but it relates to precisely that point. But I wanted to talk about the point that you made specifically with respect to omniscience, because of course that's really for a lot of people that's the central question, right? Whether you want to say omnipotence or omniscience are sort of different sides of the same coin. And I'm inclined to agree with you there. They're distinct, but they're definitely connected with one another. The question of does divine foreknowledge determine human action is a very old, and it's a perennial question. Typically, the way that folks have tried to address that is to discuss the distinction between time and eternity, right? And say, well, the problem is that we think of time in a linear way, whereas God thinks of the whole. Right. And so the question is, God isn't seeing you do something prior to you doing it. Rather, God sees all of time and space sort of in one simultaneous moment. for lack of a better term. And so in that sense, nothing that God perceives in terms of your action interferes with your capacity to do it, right? It's not a linear causal sequence in that respect. And the analogy that I like to use in this regard is, it's like when you go into a movie theater, or I'm sorry, when you go into an art gallery and you look at a painting on the wall, and you see sort of the painting as a whole, right? And so you see everything in the painting in one moment, rather than if you were to say go and see a mural where you see kind of like one moment of the mural taking place after the other. Rather, God sees us more in the sense of looking at a portrait in a portrait gallery, rather than in the sense of sort of watching events transpire from a hillside far away or something like that.
Mm-hmm. Socka?
Yeah. So just the point that what you pointed out with the lamp there, and I like your response is that you would say that it's potent in that sense, but not omnipotent. And that's kind of what I was addressing there, is that when you start limiting the range of scopes of things that something can't do, beyond just the things that are self-contradictory, to include other things as well, that you're taking away from that, and it wouldn't be omnipotent anymore. And the same challenge we put back and say that, well, now you've just described God as this potent thing and not this omnipotent thing. But to the concept of time and that and how it relates to God, and I mean, this is like, well, you're right. There's just layers to this. Is that that time has to exist in some sense, that even within the realm of a being like God, like a basic kind of sequence of events, is that there is a state in which God has created reality, and there is a state in which God has not created reality. Both those states exist, but they can't exist at the same time. So God cannot exist in both those states at the same time. He can't be, creating reality, haven't created reality yet, or experience a reality that he has created. Those are three different states that a God cannot exist in at the same temporal moment. And to say that he can't exist across all those states at the same time, or else he's infinitely not creating, eternally not creating, eternally creating, and eternally existing in his creation all at the same time.
But I think the distinction there is that, because you used the term, God can't do those things all at the same temporal moment. But that's precisely the point, right? God doesn't exist in that respect in a temporal moment, right? God exists outside of all temporal moments. So in a real sense, everything that you described is simultaneous to God. And so therefore, in that respect, there is no kind of place within that sort of before, during, after framework that you laid out where God sort of exists. There's not a point where there's not a prior, in other words, to creation. In this sense, by the way, I'll just note that there's an interesting correlation, I'll say, between the conception of time that I'm working with and the way that time is often understood in the context of Big Bang Theory, in that we talk about time in the context of the Big Bang Theory as something that begins at the moment of Big Bang, right? We can talk about what there was before the Big Bang, because there is no before to the Big Bang. Time as a concept begins at the moment of the Big Bang. So it exists within the sphere of creation. And I think the same thing can be said by analogy with the way we think about the relationship of God to creation. So because time exists for us within the sphere of the universe in which we dwell. But outside of the universe within which we dwell, again, thinking about it from the perspective of there being a God, that God doesn't relate to our temporal reality in the same way that we relate to it.
Right. So, but then the issue with that, okay, and you do bring up a good point, is that that understanding of time, of matter in motion, would only be predicated on the fact that there is matter that is moving. So that has to be stuff that happens, post Big Bang, post creation. Mm-hmm. But the other way that you look at it is that so prior to so imagine a reality prior to the Big Bang. whether or not in that state before matter and motion that there were still things that had antecedent causes to them. Okay, so even like if we take this that before creation that there's God, okay, and that we can't measure time in the same way that God has, that we measure time in inside the universe there, but there still is a sequence of events, okay, that would have to happen. You can almost call this God time. Is that time in that reality can become a measure of God's movements, not physical movements, but maybe just movements of thought. Okay, that there was a thought prior to creation, and there was a thought during creation, there was a thought after creation, and these had to happen in some type of order. Okay, and that whether it's not the time that we can recognize, it still is temporal in the sense that these events would have required the antecedent event to exist, not simultaneously, but in some type of sense prior to it, just not in a way that we can dictate by the time measurement that we use here.
Yeah, I like your use of the term God time there. I think that's a really fruitful concept because it actually connects to sort of a distinction that exists within Greek between chronos on the one hand, which is sort of temporal succession of moment after moment, and kairos, right? And kairos in Greek it has to do with the idea of sort of what the theologian Paul Tillich once referred to as the eternal now. Right. In other words, so God time is in that sense very much the eternal now. Right. And it's not that it doesn't. And the idea of the eternal now is interesting to me because what it suggests is not that there is a moment where there are no nows. Rather, it means that there's a moment where every now is now. And I could probably pull a Spaceballs analogy out if I remembered the scene well enough, but the Mel Brooks movie where they're looking at Spaceballs, the movie from within the movie, right? And they're talking about now is now. But I think that idea of when we talk about God time, I think the idea is, I think where we're hitting a snag is the idea that God time or Kairos or however we want to think about it is sort of a point which is sort of temporally distinct from any point within our time rather than existing in all times. Now, again, if you don't subscribe to that metaphysics, then this is not going to be at all helpful in thinking about the issue, right? So, but I'm just talking about the way in which these questions have often been addressed, right? So, the question of time and eternity, and is there such a thing as eternity? That's a metaphysical thicket that we would probably get lost in and never be heard from again. But in terms of sort of clarifying the conceptual terrain, I think it's useful in terms of thinking about these things.
When you referred to his coining the phrase there, God time, what do you have to say to what Socka had said about how, if you want to call it God time or whatever, about how he's saying there had to be, whether it's the time we experience or this God time, that there still has to be a chronology of events. You're talking about, the concept of Kairos, everything happening at once. God had to have that impulse to create the universe, and then he had to create the universe, and then he had to exist with us with the universe created. There has to be a chronology, no matter what your concept of time is, doesn't there?
I'm not sure that there. I'm not. It's not that I'm not sure that there is or there has to be. I'm fairly certain there doesn't have to be. Insofar as, again, the problem is we perceive time sort of in succession, right? But if you think about it from the perspective of this idea of Kairos, then it's much more the idea that there is no succession, right? So there is no before God created. God is eternally creating, right? And we perceive it temporally because we are temporal creatures, right? So when we talk about God exists from eternity, God creates from eternity. So, the idea that there was sort of a moment prior to the Big Bang, when God kind of said, Like it's the James Weldon Johnson poem, right? Like in that case, it was a man, right? I think I'll make me a universe, right? And that therefore, then prior to that, there was nothing, and then there was something. From this sort of chirological perspective, I think what we're talking about much more is the idea that, well, no, God from eternity elects to create, and then we experience that creation temporally from the moment of the Big Bang on forward to whatever its consummation is.
But it's really easy just to pay like the lip service to it, to say that these events are all kind of happening eternally, simultaneously, whatever. But I mean, like I brought up like three examples, like a state prior to creation, a state during creation, and a state after creation. But there's every single example, especially within the Christian Bible. The Christian kind of viewpoint of this is that there's different interactions that God has with the world, and there's a state that that we can recognize in that sense, from a temporal place. That prior to this moment, God didn't interact. Post this moment, did interact, and that just to say that like all those events from the viewpoint of God that they're happening simultaneously. Now, remember that the first thing that you talked about with omnipotence is that God can do anything that is kind of like logically possible, as long as it doesn't entail an inherent contradiction. The entire kind of explanation of God's actions is one of your direct violation of basic principles of logic. Is that he's existing at these states where he's doing different things. He's creating. He's not creating. He's post-creation. He's interacting with the world, not interacting with the world. All these things are happening, you're seeing simultaneously. And that's fine. Like, I mean, if you want to put the there, but now you have this God that is literally acting in a way that is completely, illogical from any kind of measure that we can understand this. And so we have to do like these, to try to do to try to explain this away and in some type of form. But I still don't think that it gets you out of the problem that there are these inherent contradictions to the statements you're making.
Well, let me ask this. So Socka coined God time. Do we now have to coin another phrase and say there's logic, but then there's God logic?
Well, no, but I do think that there's a way of, first of all, I mean, I think when you say that it's contradictory, right, it's contradictory only sort of from the perspective of like looking at these things like from the wrong end of the telescope, for lack of a better term. In other words, I think the problem is it would be contradictory to say God did thing X and then did God, this other thing Y, which would be contradictory from a temporal perspective, but not necessarily contradictory if you're looking at it from the perspective of God operating God operating from the perspective of eternity. The analogy that I think is useful, my daughter just finished reading Slaughterhouse-Five for school, which is one of my favorite novels. And it's been a long time since I've read it, so I'm going to forget the name of the alien species that they talk about in the novel. But one of the things that I always found fascinating about them is the idea that for them, sort of, I used the portrait gallery analogy before, that's sort of how they perceive time, right? Is that you sort of move from one picture to another and you perceive the whole thing kind of in a moment. And I think that if you understand that, then you understand that the idea of what's taking place in any particular point in time, is not contradictory to how God understands it within eternity. I'm doing a poor job of explaining this, but
well, there might be a reason for that because
okay, but you could say it's hard to explain because it's contradictory, but I think that the problem is more that it's just a complex concept, right? So the distinction between time and eternity is not, well, we're trying to grasp it from the point of view of temporal creatures, right? So if there's a God, and if God exists in eternity in the way that I've been describing, then our attempt to understand what it is that God is or does and how that God interacts with us as temporal creatures is going to be difficult to grasp. Again,
well, hey, just go ahead and say it. I don't want to dumb it down, but just go ahead and say it, Scott. Go ahead and say it.
Which bit?
mysterious ways.
I didn't say that,
Okay,
but I will.
that's all I was thinking of though when you were
Well,
explaining.
but we could have a long conversation about mystery. But for me, I'm sorry to keep pulling out these literary analogies. Have you read the novel Flatland?
Yeah, I have.
Yeah, Flatland's to me a fascinating novel, precisely because what it does is it asks this question of what would it be like for a two-dimensional creature to interact with a three-dimensional creature, right? And how would a two-dimensional creature go about describing a three-dimensional world to other two-dimensional creatures? To me, that's very much an analogy to trying to describe an eternal being in a temporal context. We can do it in intelligible ways, but we can't do it easily, and we can't do it perfectly.
Well, I mean, it's a problem with analogies. Analogies are never quite, one-for-one exchanges. But I mean, there's a certain point with analogies where we have to talk about what is it analogous to. So when we say that God is a creature that operates within the rules of logic, is that something that we are talking about as kind of like a literal read at its surface type thing? Or when we describe that God operating with the rules of logic, that's actually analogous to a different type of logic, that because we can say that this being is operating in conjunction with the basic principles of logic. But then we can bring up examples how those things, like the principles of logic, for example, that A can't be not A at the same time and the same reference. Mm-hmm. So it's actually baked into the type of logic that we're talking about here is the understanding that the law of identity or the would require something, or not the law of identity, but the law of
non-contradiction.
Yeah, law of non-contradiction can't only applies to in a temporal sense. And so now you're talking about this being that's not a temporal sense, but yet again, the rules for this being have to operate within these principles of logic. But we're not talking about that anymore, because we're not talking about temporal type of logic as we understand it. So when we say that God is logical, then we're using that. Is that an analogy for some type of God logic, or like how is it analogous?
Well, I'm understanding it to be sort of just straight up logic, by which I mean, again, you're right. Temporality is baked into the cake when you're talking about the law of non-contradiction, right? So, you could say God can't create a married bachelor, but at point A, there's this person and they're a bachelor, and then at point B, they're married, and so in a certain non-temporal way, they're a married bachelor. But of course, I don't think that's typically what's understood. Rather, the point is that kind of it's a way of addressing questions like, can God create a rock so big that God can't lift it, right? Or can God create a square circle, right? And the idea is within that framework of the law of non-contradiction and law of identity and the law of the excluded middle, that we don't have a that within that framework, including the temporal dimension of it, that God couldn't do those things, right? And this, yeah, go ahead, John.
No, I was going to say on this point too, the law of non-contradiction, in some senses, wouldn't the idea of the Trinity violate the law of non-contradiction?
Oh, geez.
Well, we're getting far afield into.
Well, no, I just figured you could give like a quick 20-second answer to that. No,
come on, give a quick 20-second answer to explaining the Trinity. I'm on Scott's side here. Yeah. That's the next hangout.
Yeah, sorry to throw that bomb into the middle of things, but yeah, go ahead. We can ignore that.
Okay, actually, well, let me I'll just drop my own bomb, and we don't have to pursue it. But I think that the answer to that question is the problem of thinking that God's oneness and God's threeness are sort of kind of different categories existing within God. And in this respect, I think that it's better to say that God is that what God is not three and one. God possesses three in oneness, right? So, or works better in German, right? Dreieinigkeit. And so, that God exists eternally as three and one, not as sort of three over here and one over here. But again, that's taking us really far afield, and perhaps I can come back another day and talk about it.
Next stream.
So back on the topic there. This is the kind of the main one that I kind of like to want to jump in on, was whether or not God's omnipotence would kind of invalidate the concept of free will. And you had said that that freedom is the capacity to make a choice. Okay. Now that's interesting. The definition, because I think that like that covers actually kind of a obviously like the classic kind of idea of like libertarian free will, but it also covers weak determinism as well, because within weak determinism you have the capacity to make a choice. You just only have one choice. But I think that like generally when the like free will, we're talking about something the ability to make a choice outside of coercion. Okay. And that's the idea. So if you put a gun to somebody's head and say do this, like that type of coercion, like is an example, just like kind of like the prejudice act on it. But the argument against that is that there's so much aspects of the environment and like the nature around us, the experiences we've had that lead into every single kind of decision that we do make. The perceived idea that we actually have these choices to begin with, that we see reality operating in a lot of ways that completely kind of being coerced into by our past experiences, our environment, all this other stuff, and that the choice itself might not be as much of a choice as we thought it was. And the problem is, when you have like a hard line determinist come out and talk about this, they will reference the the basic kind of uniformity of nature, like these natural laws, the way that essentially like everything is just moving like toppling dominoes, and there's really no choice to anything. And the fact that we think that we have a choice is purely this illusion. And I think that there's actually like some arguments against that type of hardline determinism. What I fall into a problem is, and I am going to agree with John on this one, is that I think that the biggest people that have a problem getting out of any type of deterministic viewpoints would actually be the Christians, because of the omnipotent God. Because the God would have to create the reality, and like John brought up the scripture earlier on, that God knew you before the foundations of the world. That before everything happened, He knew what you were going to do, actually do, and that when God created reality in the Christian worldview, your path was set. Now that just seems like that. Well, you might have this kind of illusion of free will. That the choices that you have there were almost certainly coerced, and coerced at the most simplest level by the fact that it was created. The fact that the reality was created in this way would be an example of like the ultimate type of coercion to get you that point, especially if you never had a choice from before the foundations of the world were set.
So there is a lot of different sort of angles that I'd like to approach that from. So, but let me start here. So I think that, first of all, in terms of the question of sort of, do I subscribe to something like libertarian freedom or something more along the lines of a weak determinism, I think the jury for me is kind of out on that. I think what I would say is I'd sort of begin from a phenomenological perspective, insofar as sort of I experience myself as free. I experience myself as having choice. And so when I talk about myself as having freedom, the question of whether or not from a metaphysical perspective, divine plan or anything like that, whether I'm actually free in any sense, to me is of less importance than the fact that I perceive myself as a free being having choice, and therefore kind of in Jean-Paul Sartre style, sort of burdened by the sort of the recognition of my freedom. In other words, even if my choices are determined, I still experience them as free. All that having been said,
that would be just that's just the basic kind of metaphysical problem that we run into with this whole thing. Is that what would reality look like if it was deterministic? Well, pretty much exactly the same as it looks like right now. It'd be hard to differ. Any choice that you make right now, any choice that you think that you're making, is merely just an illusion, and that's just the position of determinism. So like the fact that we can have this kind of like well, it feels like I'm making a choice, So that's great, people that if libertarian free will wasn't was true, if it was reality, then that's what it would feel like. But it would also feel like that if determinism was true too. So it's not really like a position that you can ground anything in.
Well, but I have the same problem.
Real quick, Scott. I just want to say too. Now, and from what I heard you say, before Socka jumped in, it sounds to me like when you say, "Well, do I really have free will? Do I really have choice?" No, but I feel like I have choice. It sounds like you're answering the question that this topic came out of. You're answering the question no. You're saying that no, we don't have the free will is negated by God's omnipotence.
Oh no, see, because that was, well, first of all, I just want to point out that was only the first part of my thinking.
Oh, okay. Well,
I had a and then that I was going to follow up with. But I did want to say in response to Socka that I think that I have the same problem with what you just said as I have with like someone like Daniel Dennett saying, well, you don't really have a self, right? It's just brain activity, but there's no self behind the brain activity, which is, of course, I have a self. I'm experiencing myself at all times. I'm less certain you have a self, but I know I have a self. But you're right insofar as this distinction subjectively between what the world would look like if it were determinist and what it would look like if it weren't determinist. From my perspective, it wouldn't look very much different. But what I wanted to kind of follow up on that and say is, I think that the bigger question about human freedom vis-a-vis an omnipotent God has to do with the question of, well, in what regard or let me put it differently, what is God doing when God creates? And how does God's creating of a world create a realm for freedom to exist apart from God? And what I would say is that creation is an act of what is called kenosis, which is divine self-limitation. In other words, God circumscribes the realm of divine activity through creation in order to leave a universe which has freedom vis-a-vis God. Now, you're right. The initial conditions of that universe limit the sort of full capacity for freedom, because we're free only within the context of sort of the limitations of that universe. But within those limitations, the possibilities for freedom which exist for creation, which includes not just humans but the entirety of creation, are functionally infinite. And so the question then is, so within those sort of functionally infinite possibilities, are we free as agents to choose from the various possibilities that are with which we're confronted? And of course, again, we're further circumscribed by circumstances of life. The circumstances I was born in the United States rather than being born in the Philippines or something like that. That nevertheless, as an agent choosing from within my circumstances, I am free to choose between option A and option B.
Well, what would you need? Like, okay, so let's say that something simple, like what'd you have for breakfast this morning?
It's a smoothie.
A smoothie. What did you have? Waffles.
Well, I didn't have waffles because I'm trying to watch my weight.
So that's it. So you made that choice. Like, you thought about that. The reason why you went with a smoothie because of waffles is because you chose that because of so it was a. Do you think that you could have freely chosen to have waffles instead?
Probably not. They don't think we have any in the house. But
Okay.
we got a waffle maker and flour, so I could have probably had waffles if I were ambitious enough.
I guess. Yeah, it's like when there's ever any decision like between option A and option B, like I shouldn't have asked such a generic kind of question there, or like as first, sorry, not generic, sorry, like more. I shouldn't have asked such a specific question there, because I think that like regardless of what the choice that you think that you made was, you chose option A, and then you take a look at like what could have possibly influenced me to make option B instead, and then you could usually kind of follow back and through a bunch of like extremely kind of like like dry, boring questions for like the next 15 minutes. We can maybe attack the possibility that you even had a choice to make option B, whether or not that was something that you even could have come to a decision you come to, because so many things were influencing the decision to make option A in the first place. But again, like it's like I don't think that we have that ability to choose things. I don't think we have the ability to choose our beliefs. I think that everything happens is just kind of involuntarily in that sense, is that we are kind of reacting to things on the most part, and even if we do have even like the slightest kind of ability to that we're not just completely philosophical zombies, that our choices are always going to be limited to a set of one. In that case, is that you wouldn't be able to move outside of that choice. You could freely choose, I guess, but unfortunately, you can choose one option.
And real quick before you respond, Scott, I just wanted to ask Nokasuchi, because the three of us have been such gentlemen, he has not had to intervene as a moderator, but I just wanted to give Nokasuchi a chance to maybe give his thoughts on the discussion thus far, since he hasn't had to moderate too much.
Well, I'm really enjoying the conversation and the back and forth. I think some really good things have come up. I'm having a little bit of fun in the chat, but I'll give my thoughts near the end. But I'm glad that this is a calm conversation. This is the type of conversation I'd really like to have with Christians on the regular, and have the whole rage sessions be a rare thing. So I'm just really enjoying it.
Awesome. And
I
just want to say to Socka real quick, that I don't know if what he was talking about a few minutes ago, does that at all relate to the voting analogy or thought experiment you were telling me about the other day?
Well, yeah, I mean, yeah, it's the Scott. Sorry, I'll give you a chance to respond here in a second. The kind of like viewpoint on compatibilism, where you have these two different positions, complete absolute kind of like free will, and the other one where everything is kind of determined. But then there's people that try to branch these two together, try to merge them and be like, listen, we're not just these zombies, walking around that actually have no capability to think and make a choice for ourselves. Like that has to be, a kind of an ingredient to reality. Because when you go with the position of hardline determinism, that you can't even freely make any, have a thought of something. Like if I was to, say pink elephants right now, how many people in the audience just thought of pink elephants? Did you have a choice? As soon as you heard the words, your mind probably maybe went to that and started going to it. Maybe it's not an example just like that. Maybe it's just like whenever people hear my voice, that they have that experience where it's just like, oh my God, fucking Socka's talking again. Jesus, will somebody please shut him up? He started going. I don't have a half hour to finish listening to this.
I knew you was going there.
Yeah, but that those, is that an actual thought that you think that you're making, or is that thought itself just merely kind of that did you even have a choice to make that thought? Now with compatibilism, the example that they give to kind of illustrate the freedom to choose one type of option is that imagine that you're like you vote for the same political party every single year. Okay, you always vote for them. Every single time an election comes up, you're always voting for that party. But that party is starting to lose support, and taking people when they go to visit the doctor, something sneaking in there and putting a microchip in their brain. And that microchip is only going to activate if the next time that that person's in a voting booth, they decide that they're going to vote for the opposite party. And you go into the voting booth the next time you're around, and you got your two options between the parties there, and you vote for the same party that you always vote for. And you know that the microchip didn't need to activate. Okay, but did you have a choice then? Because even if you had thought about doing, voting for the other party, would have triggered, and you would have voted for the same party regardless. And as much as you think that you had a choice there, and as you did technically have a choice, but the set of choices that you actually had to act on was one. So you could only ever choose to do what you're chosen to do.
I do think there's a distinction, if I'm understanding your analogy correctly, I think there's a distinction between a choice that you make that is made of your own volition versus a choice that you make which is coerced. So even if you say, well, the outcome is the same in either case, there is a distinction psychologically and potentially morally for you in terms of whether or not you freely make the choice or if the choice is compelled by the microchip.
Well, yeah, that's exactly it. Is that I think that one of the reasons why they come up with compatibilism is to keep in this aspect of moral responsibility. If everything is purely deterministic, that someone going out and killing somebody, it was not a choice that they made. It was just a series of molecules moving through reality, and interacting with another series of molecules, and we interpret that as a murder just happened. That's what we call it, but really it's just it's all just basic physics. The idea of compatibilism is that it takes outside of that realm a little bit and says that that event was going to happen. That event was determined to happen. That there's still a certain amount of moral culpability to the person that did it because they did make that choice. Right. Now, the fact that it was the only choice they could make doesn't matter. It was still a choice that they did make.
Right. The outcome is the same, but the disposition of the person making the choice is different.
Yeah, it's the difference between being a philosophical zombie or a robot compared to just being softly determined or pushed in that direction to act in that way. Right. But I have about 7 more minutes, and so I'm going to throw a curveball at you, Scott, because it's fun.
All right.
One of the things that I find interesting about free will is that the way that you described it is that it's that capacity to make a choice. Okay, and that's a really kind of interesting idea, is that you can make a choice, and the way that I kind of expanded upon that is to kind of separate it from the compatibilist viewpoint is to the capacity to make a choice uncoerced. Mm-hmm. And that in order for you to be able to make that choice free of coercion is that there has to be a certain couple other things that go along with that. That first off, that you have to have more than one available choice to act on. You can't be just even I think within the compatibilist viewpoint there, you only have one choice whether you recognize it or not. But with actual free will is that there has to be more than one choice. Okay. And the other thing is that there has to be a state where you're uncertain about the end point. Okay, is that if you had all knowledge, for example, that you would know what the actions of your choices were. In fact, you would know what your choice is going to be. So if you had you were omnipotent and you had that omniscience of all actions, again, you would just be going and acting in the way that you already know that you're going to act. And the other thing that you need to do, because of that, the other thing you need to do in order to be able to make a choice is that you can't know the future. Okay, Because if you know if you know the future, you know what choice you're going to make, and therefore you're not actually really making a choice. Now, these are the things that hold us kind of morally culpable, to our actions under kind of like a libertarian free will type of system. That you have multiple choices, that you're uncertain about what the choices are going to be in the long run, and that you don't have forethought of the future in order to make that. Those are all the things that need to kind of apply in order to be a being with free will. But you notice that in that case, that a God, for example, especially an omniscient, omnipotent type of God, doesn't meet those characteristics. That they have that forethought of the future. They don't have that state of uncertainty before any choice that they make. And any action that they move is almost going to be predetermined by the fact that they know what action they're going to take. And which would mean that a God that's acting in this way could not be a God that operates free will. That God is acting in the way that most determinist thing. It's just kind of in line with its nature, just moving it through the motions with these perceived choices. And the problem is that these things would also make a God like that not personable. You couldn't influence it with your prayers, your desires, your request to this being, your wishes, doesn't matter what you want to call it. It could not be swayed. And which would mean that I would say that the God of the Bible, as a personable God, could not exist as a personable God if it does have these traits of omniscience and omnipotence, because it could not be a personal being with free will to interact with the way that the Bible describes interacts.
God is an automaton.
Well, I know you're pressed for time here. Let me see if there's a lot packed into what you just said, but let me see if I can. First of all, I suppose I want to start by saying, I think that the definition that I started with vis-a-vis freedom is not a particularly good definition of freedom if the question is, in what sense is God free? And particularly given the way that you described it, assuming, and I have to think about it a bit more, if I agree with you that all of those are constituent elements of what it means to be free. If I were to agree with you, then I would still say that God is free. It's just that we're talking about freedom in two different senses. And I would say that the reason why I chose the definition that I was working with is precisely because that seemed to be the one that sort of was most fruitful for having this conversation of, is divine omnipotence compatible with human freedom, right? That capacity to choose. But there's another way of thinking about freedom as well. And I thought a bit about this before we met today, which is freedom can also be understood as doing that which is most fully in keeping with your own nature. And in that sense, God is completely free, kind of wholly self-actualized in the Aristotelian sense. And we as human beings are free only insofar as we are actualized with respect to our sort of being created in the image of God. Again, I think that's an interesting way of conceiving of freedom. It's a different conversation. But I think that, again, from the question of because I understood the question to be, do we get to choose if God's omnipotent? So therefore I was working within that definition. But if we wanted to have a conversation about what does it mean for God to be free, again, that's another interesting conversation for another day. I'd probably want to work with a different way of thinking about the question of freedom.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of an interesting kind of idea there. And again, one of the problems when we start referring to God is that we have these ideas of free will, determinism, of moral culpability, just sort of these actions, and these things that we apply to us in that sense. But then whenever we try to go and see like how these things relate to God's interactions with this creation, we get pushed back into this position where, well, we can't talk about it in quite the same way. It's always got to be a little bit different.
Yeah, our language about God is always equivocal in that sense.
Our ways are not God's ways, right?
Right. Well, and of course, the
Yeah.
way that this is often talked about is there's a distinction between kind of the via positiva and the via negativa, or apophatic and cataphatic theology, right? And so, if you want to talk about it from the perspective of the via positiva, you can say, well, God is free in specifically, these ways. But then, of course, from the via negativa, you can say at the same time, God is not free in the sense that God's freedom is not like the freedom that we as human beings experience, precisely because the language is always equivocal. So you can always say both yay and nay to any sort of attempted categorization of God.
Well, if you grant Sokka's premise, about how he's describing how God couldn't have free will, then if that was the case, then you would have to say that, of course, human beings don't have free will. If the person who, or the being that created everything and controls everything and is omniscient and has a plan and all that, then, of course, if we grant his premise, then human beings have no free will at all then either.
Right. Well, of course, that there's a lot resting on that if we grant the premise line, and I'm not 100% sure I do, but I still think that I guess there are two things I would say. One of which is that, again, I want to kind of go back to that distinction between the kind of the cataphatic and the apophatic, right? I think you can say apophatically, yes, God is unfree, or God is not free, in the sense that God's freedom is not coterminous with a human conception of freedom, right? And God is free in ways that human beings are very different from the way human beings are free. But of course, the other side of that is that insofar as human freedom is defined in this libertarian sense that we've been working with, then one of the things that suggests is that, and again, we could go deep into theological weeds on this as well, that of course, to be free is precisely in that sense to be capable of going contrary to God, right? And so what we tend to talk about as freedom exists precisely because we relate to our world in a way very differently than God does.
Well, I know Sokka's going to have to get out of here in a minute, but you say contrary to God. I mean, is it in fact possible for someone to take an action that is contrary to God? I mean, because if God is omniscient and God has a plan, well, then he knew I was going to be an atheist. He knew that, person A down the street was going to be a blasphemer. He knew that so-and-so was going to be, in and out of prison his whole, I mean, how can you be contrary to God if he knew what you were going to do before you ever did it?
Right. Well, I think there are a couple of possible answers to that. One of which is going back to the time and eternity conversation that we had a while back. But there's another way, again, I want to go back to sort of, this is more my way of thinking about this. I mean, I say mine, this is not original to me. But, if we think about creation as a realm of freedom distinct from God, then that means that the universe, in fact, could potentially have the possibility of surprising God, right? That again, if God limits God's omnipotence vis-a-vis the universe in order for the universe to be free to go its own way, then it's also possible that God limits divine omniscience in order to allow the universe to surprise God. This is a position that I've heard John Polkinghorne advocate. I think it's
I think it's completely just ridiculous to think that somebody can restrict their own omniscience.
Why?
That feels like completely right off the start, just like starting off on the wrong foot on that one.
I mean, if you do, on what he said, just real quick. So, what you're kind of proposing is, so wouldn't God have to know what he wasn't going to allow himself to know beforehand? I mean, that's I'm lost on that, limiting omniscience. I mean, how would a being decide what they're not going to allow themselves to know when they know everything?
Well, again, the point is that if God engages in this act of self-limitation, right, vis-a-vis the world, then what God says from eternity is this realm of the universe is a realm in which I allow it the freedom to go its own way, which means that I don't know what it's going to do.
So now you're saying God isn't omniscient.
Well, it would be. We got to understand too that this is a different point than, and I'm not quite sure. I don't think that Scott's saying that he advocates for this position, because it goes against the idea that God's eternal, observing all things equally at the same time. That those two positions are inconsistent with each other.
Right, and I'm not sure. I'm not advocating either one of them necessarily. What I'm saying is that they're both possibilities. And I mean, heck, if I knew what the actual answer was, then I'd live in a much bigger house. But from my perspective, it's always a question of, so what are the possibilities that are consistent with, what we understand and observe, and what comes to us through the tradition, and how we engage with other theologians and with people who raise challenging questions like you guys are. And it seems to me that one possibility is God exists outside of time and eternity, and therefore God knows all things simultaneously. And there are many people who have advocated that position. I think the position that I just described I think it's an intriguing position. It's very consistent with points of view developed, for example, in process theology. I think the person that I rely most on, sort of who advocates that position very well, as I was starting to say, was John Polkinghorne. He is, I don't know if you know who he is, but he's a physicist and a theologian, really interesting guy. And he's made some very novel arguments, specifically grounded in his background as a theoretical physicist, in terms of how God and the universe may be compatible with one another.
Well, on that note, Scott, it was great talking with you. I hope we actually do this again, because I really enjoyed it. But Nok, thanks for hosting. John, thanks for inviting me. I got to get out to here and pay attention to the family. So I will talk to you guys later.
All right, Socka. Always a pleasure, man.
Yeah, thanks for coming on, Socka. And now, it'll just be John and Scott for a while, and I'll get some thoughts and maybe ask a couple questions at the end.
Sure. I should mention that I should probably have to go pretty soon too, because my family's out in the living room watching a movie without me. So I'll be around for a while longer.
Right.
Yeah, no problem at all. So go ahead, John.
I was just going to say, and I don't necessarily know as we need to go that much longer. I mean, we can start wrapping things up now. I think it was a fruitful conversation, thus far. I think we fleshed things out quite well. To continue on would probably, to be moving on to new topics, and we can save those for another stream. But
I do have one thought that I would like to get Scott's opinion on. So if we're talking, the omnis, and you clarified your definition fairly well at the very beginning. You said, it would be all things that are possible. And I think that we'd have to agree all things that are possible for God. I think God's possibilities would be beyond our own. How would we know if this omnipotent being with what I would call unlimited possibilities as compared to humans, if he wanted us to think we had free will while denying us free will, how would we ever know that we didn't actually have that free will to begin with?
I don't think we would. To be honest, to me, this is sort of it's the problem of we only live inside of our own heads, right? And so if the universe turns out to be very different than I subjectively experience it, then I may never know that that's the case. In fact, it's entirely likely that I won't. And something that I often say when I'm talking about these things in classes is, and it's really sort of mind-blowing for students when you first tell them this and they have to sort of grapple with it, is that we never actually experience the world. We only experience our own nervous system. And so from that perspective, I don't know anything about the world. I only know the world as it comes to me through my sensory apparatus, through what my nervous system tells me, through through all of my organs of perception. And so it could be that the world is very different from that. And I would say the same thing goes with freedom. If God has designed me to to perceive myself as free when in fact I'm not free, then I would have no way of ever being able to know that. I think actually that's something that Socka was getting at with that conversation about sort of spelling determinism and compatibilism. I think that, to me, that's actually not a question I care very much about, precisely because...
What happened to the screen?
I don't know.
Sorry, I was getting the outro ready.
Hey, go ahead, Scott.
Just to finish up my thought real quick, it's something I don't care very much about because, again, I think that it's one of those things that could potentially be the case and we would never know it. And so I can only rely on my self-perception as a free being to guide my actions. And if the world is different than I perceive it, I'll never know it.
Yeah, well, I think that was a great answer. Thank you.
And you know, you mentioned about how you only know what your perceptions tell you. And I've said for the longest time, okay, everything we are, everything we'll ever be is in the 3 pounds of mush inside our skull here. And our bodies are just life support systems for our brains and information gathering devices for our brains. So you're right. If your information gathering organs or whatever are flawed, then, you know, maybe you are getting a misperception of reality. I mean, we wouldn't know it if we were. And, you know,
not even flawed. I mean, it could just be that our sensory apparatus are well adapted to helping us survive in a world that is very different than the world that our sensory apparatus are actually engaged with. It's the whole what's it like to be a bat question, right? You know, is a bat world or a dog world radically different perceptually from a human world?
And, you know, when I alluded to wrapping things up, I was going to, and Naka, please feel free to jump in this, like to wrap things up. I'd just like to take a couple minutes, and I know you said you had to go, so we don't have to go at length on it, and just touch on the sub issue that we mentioned earlier that got this ball rolling, you know, on Twitter. There is that you know, how humans' ability to interpret the scripture, how does that mitigate God's omniscience? Because as was brought up in that thread, why, if God's all powerful, why didn't he, you know, have the Bible created such that anybody could understand it with no interpretation?
Right. So, I mean, again, this probably could have been a whole nother hour all on its own, but I guess the short version of the answer that I would give to that is that, again, this is where the freedom thing comes in, right? In other words, God doesn't create us to just be sort of kind of receptacles of divine revelation. God creates us to be, you know, free recipients of what God wants to tell us. But that means to be free recipients of what God wants to tell us, then we have to be able to interpret it, right? Because if it's just sort of kind of like zapped into our brain, like Neo learns how to do kung fu in the Matrix, then we're not actually free recipients of it. We're just sort of receptacles for it. And I think there's a big difference between being a recipient and being a receptacle, if that makes any sense. And for me, this ultimately means that, so we encounter scripture from the point of view of sort of limited finite human beings reading accounts of other limited finite human beings encountering God, right? And then the question is our understanding of God, is it consistent with what we find in those texts, right? So, I've often said, so the question is, when I experience God and I read the Bible and I see there's lots of stuff in the Bible, it's not all consistent with itself, but is the overall message that I take from the Bible consistent with how I understand and experience God? And if so, then I think I'm on the right track. And if I see something's awry, then there's some questions that need to be asked. But I also want to say that I think that the Bible is in dialogue, not just with us as readers, but I think the Bible is in dialogue with itself. I will often say that the Bible contains minority reports. passages and entire books that exist to call into question other bits of the Bible. And so from that perspective, we as readers are invited into a conversation among the writers of the Bible about how they understand and interpret God, rather than, being people kind of sitting in front of the TV watching a beer commercial, being told, buy this beer. And then it's just a question of, do we buy the beer or do we not buy the beer, right? It's a much more interesting way of reading the Bible, to be honest.
Naka, do you have any thoughts on that?
That's really interesting. I've heard that before, and I think that I agree. I'm doing this whole, chapter by chapter review of the Bible, and I'm trying to be my obnoxious self. But at the same time, as I've read the Bible probably 9 times, beginning to end, and I've always kind of joked about how Christians don't, cherry pick verses. They don't read it from beginning to end. But I've really come to an understanding that each book of the Bible really stands out on its own, and I think that it is designed to have a conversation with itself. So I think I really agree with what Scott is saying.
So now, just to start wrapping things up here, Scott, do you, as far as like in the video description when this post is a video, would you like people to know what your Twitter handle is? Do you have a YouTube channel?
I don't have a YouTube channel. My Twitter handle is @ScottPaeth. I do have a blog, which is just scottpaeth.com. And other than that, I'm on the internets.
Right.
Various forms.
And please DM me a link to your blog, and I will make sure that makes it into the video description.
Yeah, I would love to have you back on. This was a great conversation. I'd love to talk with you a lot more.
It was
and on that note too, when Nok closes things out here, please hang out for a minute after we're done being live, because I want to talk a quick minute with you. And so I guess we're going to end things there. It sounds like we opened the door to several other topics for future conversations, which I think is great. I just want to remind everybody that I host the Apostate Alliance here on this channel, The Rage, every Sunday at 11 a.m. Eastern Time, United States. And that this week we're going to be talking to Heretical Nick. And it's going to show as a premiere at the normal time, 11 on Sunday. We're going to be recording it at Saturday night because Nick is an Aussie, so they're kind of like a day ahead of us.
Australia doesn't exist. The Earth is flat.
Oh, that's right. I forgot. But anyway, thank you so much, Scott, for joining us tonight. Thank you, Nok, for being here with us. And I will let you say whatever, shilling you have to do and close us out here.
Yeah. This was a great conversation. I want to thank you, Scott, for being here. I want to thank Socka for being here. John, been a long time since you've been in the conversational role, and so it was good to have you back in that role. Tomorrow morning, 11 a.m. Eastern, I will be premiering. Sorry, Scott. My Bible is Stupid series, Genesis chapters 5 and 6 are really stupid. That'll be at 11 a.m. Tomorrow morning. So come hang out with me in the side chat. It's about a 10-minute video. Should be a lot of fun. I think it's my most disrespectful one yet. That says a lot. Outside of that, we are going to get out of here. Great conversation. Thank you all for being here. And I have my Patreon screen. So, yeah, we're going to have that. So be the conversation, and we'll see you soon.